Oh,
Oh, we're all right up. Oh, I had this whole thing figured out. I was going to introduce Jiang as sideways, but she's right up. So there we go. Hello, everybody. Welcome to this wonderful panel on blurring whatever without nonfiction and climate fiction. So we're going to be discussing ins and outs of all that. I'm your moderator as much as I can be. I'm Nina Munteanu, and I'm going to ask each of the panelists to introduce themselves and ask them to put their contact information in the chat for people to see. And I will do the same at some point. I'm not the greatest with chat. You're muted, so just know that you need to unmute yourself. And we'll just, in fact, on my screen, you're first. So if you don't mind introducing yourself.
Hi, everyone. I am Jiang. I'm a writer of speculative fiction, trying to do more climate fiction these days. Yeah, I'm happy to be here. I'll drop my information in the chat.
Excellent. Thank you, Rob? You're muted, Rob. There you go.
Thank you. I'm going to take this opportunity to talk about myself in the third person, which never gets to happen.
Oh, cool. I like that.
Yeah, right?
That's like being sideways.
Right? Cameron Roberson writes under the pen name Rob Cameron. He's a lead organizer for the Brooklyn Speculative Fiction Writers and executive producer of CliFiCast NYC. His writing is in Magazine of Fantasy and Science Fiction, Tor.com, and Foreign Policy Magazine. Among other publications, he has a forthcoming essay in Solarpunk Magazine, and his debut middle grade novel, Daydreamer, is forthcoming from Labyrinth Road, Summer 24. And his website is robcameron.com, which I think I just put into the chat.
Excellent.
Yes, I did.
Thank you, Rob.
Oh, I did it. There it is. Oh, wait.
And
not chat with backstage during this meeting. What am I doing? Oh, I'm still in backstage.
There you are.
How about host and panel?
There you go. Are you there? There you are. There you are. Okay, so Rob's put his contact information in the chat. BrightFlame, can you introduce yourself?
Hey, everybody. I write and teach and strive to live in a solar punk way now that I have kind of jumped into solar punk wholeheartedly. I write long and short form fiction these days, more short form fiction, some that'll be coming out in Solarpunk magazine and the Bioluminescent anthology and a few other places. Teaching this stuff is really important to me, and maybe as we're talking, I'll weave in a little bit of the ways that I incorporate climate fiction and solar punk into teaching, back into writing, and it kind of all meshes together for me. I also I'm part of the reclaiming tradition. That's the spiritual tradition Starhawk co-founded. She's a good friend and mentor. I'm very proud to be connected with her. And I'm also affiliated with the Sustainability Education Center at Columbia University.
Excellent. Thank you, BrightFlame. Yes, Starhawk, amazing lady. Jiang didn't say very much about herself, so I'm going to read a few things about her. She's a Chinese-Canadian writer, immigrant from Fujian, and a member of HWA and SFWA. Her work has appeared in F and SF, Uncanny, Prairie Fire, Master's Review, and her debut novel, Ling Huan, is that how you pronounce? Yes, Ling Huan, is forthcoming with Dark Matter Inc. in April 2023.
Nice.
Looking forward to that.
Yeah, there's a lot to say there.
So again, I'm your moderator. I'm Nina Munteanu, author of a few books, I guess about 13 or so, nonfiction and fiction, mostly eco-fiction, and as well as essay writer. My latest fiction that's come out, novel, in 2020 is A Diary in the Age of Water. Oh, I'm also a scientist as well as an author. So I kind of know about that blur of nonfiction to fiction. And I love that place, that in-between place, that verge, if you will. This book, this latest book of mine, explores the impacts of climate change through 4 generations of women and their unique relationship with water, which is scarce at the time of that writing. The book is told in the form of a diary. So it's the diarist, her point of view, and she's a limnologist, a scientist. So her entries are based on real events. So that's where a lot of the blur comes in. And it's really interesting, the response of reviewers and readers to that blur. They, in some cases, readers didn't know what was real and what wasn't real. And what that did was it actually created, well, it made people love the book and hate the book. So it created this interesting interchange. We're going to discuss more of that sort of thing in the blur in this panel. And I'm hoping that's kind of a segue to one question I wanted to place to my fellow panelists. And that's the idea of talking about the difference between CliFi and sci-fi, if you will. How are these two genres? So there's, both are fiction or nonfiction, both may blur fiction and nonfiction. Where do you see these two genres as being similar? And some of you were saying that you were writing speculative fiction. And how are they different? And let's start with BrightFlame.
Well, science fiction and climate fiction, CliFi, have an overlap, definitely. Like both can have real or probable science built in and trajectories to the use of those for issues that we face in our current world, even if done in a off-world planetary alien setting that sci-fi might have or climate fiction might have. But I see climate fiction as any work that touches on the real foundation of climate science, the real state of the world now, the climate emergency that we all face, even if that's background, if it weaves in the real stuff, to me, then it's climate fiction. And so there might be overlap, but it might be trying to do this on the camera, like it might be a tiny bit of overlap, or a more full overlap, kind of depending on people's views. And climate fiction runs through all genres. The earlier panels touched on this. I'm thinking of Tori and Aya's exchange in the Solar Punk panel about the call for more like pulp fiction, not the movie, but kind of the quick read, what some might call trashy novel, but quick read, like real accessible kind of novels that might be murder mysteries or something, but that have a background at least of what we face as our current climate emergency. And I'm reminded of an interview with screenwriter Dorothy Fortenberry, who says she would, I think she pronoun, would love to see so much more climate fiction integrated into all work, and that it's best done as things like the movie Coda, which has a background of the rising seas and the destruction of fishing industry, and fewer fish in the waters. But the film is about a hearing woman with deaf parents and sibling who wants to sing. So it's a human contemporary story about her struggle to make a future where she gets to sing and yet be faithful to the needs of her family.
Mhm. Rob, can you add to that discussion?
Yeah, I think so. I think particularly if you take stories that have been um, pre-climate fiction as a title, then you're going to get a lot more. Because for me, I think climate fiction is any fiction which is specifically dealing with that particular anxiety. And that can be done outside of science fiction, inside of science fiction. When you start talking about science fiction, I do agree with BrightFlame. And now we're talking about some kind of technological or engineering component, whether it be something which is on the far edge of science fiction, be something which is totally hypothetical versus something that is, in the day that is accessible today. I think you're going to start to see a combination of those lenses. And I think also over time, you start to see a different level, a different kind of anxiety. So I was talking about, pre-climate fiction as a genre. I'm thinking about Men Like Gods, which is by Wells, I think. And basically, the whole idea of it is we are human beings on a planet somewhere else, and we want absolute control over the environment to the point where we have a whole list of all things which are alive, and we can delete them at need be if we want to control that environment. And so, and those are the good guys. They're the ones who succeed, who win, in the end, versus what we have now, where it truly is something to be fearful of. And it's kind of made its way into a more general zeitgeist that I don't think was, I think it's only grown since. So we start talking about climate fiction today. Really, it is dealing with this stress of a world which we can now, I think a lot more of us can say will look distinctively different from what we are looking at today. And then, how do you deal with that? Is there going to be a cataclysmic event which you can put into, a 2-hour movie, or is it going to be the kind of that slow drag into kind of a worldwide mainstream new way looking at things? Because essentially a lot of it is dystopian. Let's talk about solar punk. A lot of it is dystopian, and now we're talking about dystopia for a large part of the world, or rather, I will say, Western-facing world, as far as the literature and writing is concerned. Because this climate nonfiction reality has been the reality for a lot of different people for a while. They just weren't writing about it in the way that we're talking about it now.
Yeah. Jiang, what can you add to that?
Wow, that was a lot. I'm going to try to add more to that.
And you've gone sideways to make your point.
Oh no!
I can see that, which is
Yeah, I've
really,
noticed that too.
It's significant. So let's hear that sideways view.
So originally, when I was thinking about it, I thought there were far more differences than there were similarities. But the more I thought about it, I think they actually blend a lot more than expected. At first, I was thinking about how science fiction really explores like far-flung ideas, imaginations of the future, technology, space exploration, very, abstract things that we may not know about. But I feel like it can also be applied to climate fiction, those solutions we think of in the future, the technologies that we might use. And so I think both in climate fiction and in science fiction, we kind of explored the ways that we've dealt with climate and like the ways that technology has dealt with climate in the past, present, and how it might shape our future, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. It's interesting that you mentioned perspectives of science fiction, and I think our perspective has changed about science fiction, even as the genre itself has changed and matured. And I honestly think that science fiction is maturing as a genre from, you know, the stuff that Margaret Atwood was saying science fiction was, to the point where she now embraces that she is writing it. And partly, I think, because the genre itself has matured and is no longer truly identified by, you know, those three things: aliens, outer space, and whatever. and you can have earth-based science fiction. You can have what's called mundane science fiction, which is, it actually is a term in Wikipedia, which is essentially science-based. Is still, that's the whole point of science fiction, but essentially takes place in an ordinary world, mundane. It portrays the world as mundane in that way, and incorporates the science part as part of the ordinary world. Paulo Bacigalupi's Wind-Up Girl is a good example of mundane science fiction. But moving on from that to playing with the idea of blending genres, of blending nonfiction with fiction, of you know, blending CliFi with this or that, or ecofiction. You know, we're talking about all these terms, and some of that confusion is how we define those terms, right? I mean, we've all defined these terms differently. From, let's say, from Margaret Atwood, just to bring her in again, her view has evolved, and I think our view has evolved on all these terms. I just wanted to say that Kim Stanley Robinson has been quoted a number of times to say that climate fiction or climate change is such an all-pervasive reality and problem that sometime soon will come when all fiction is actually climate fiction. This is what he predicts. And some of you might agree, some people might agree with that, or think it's, or disagree, think it's hyperbolic. But, you know, he makes a good point. It touches on the relationship between CliFi and nonfiction. So in your opinion, what is that relationship? And if I can even ask this question, where's the line between CliFi and nonfiction? I'll start with Jiang.
So soon.
Got it.
So to kind of like comment on the quote, I think like in many instances, nonfiction really touches upon specific experiences by humans and like our political, cultural, and social landscape, and the way it like shifts our lives and how it impacts our personal lives. And so I think if climate change becomes a very dominant part of our lives in the future and our everyday worries, there is a good chance that a good portion of, if not all, nonfiction might become consumed by climate fiction in some ways. And in terms of the line between CliFi and nonfiction, I do think nonfiction doesn't necessarily have to be about climate fiction, like about climate, but then climate fiction in its name is very focused and emphasized on climate.
What do you mean by that? Doesn't have to be about. What do you mean by that? I know you're saying something else there.
Oh, I mean, like nonfiction in general does not necessarily have to be about climate, but climate fiction in its name, yes.
Yes, got it. Okay, Rob, what can you add to that? I keep saying that to you, Rob. What can you add to that? Sorry, I know you can.
What can you take away from that? What can you delete?
Thank you. or subtract or divide or whatever you feel like doing.
What's the exponent of this conversation? I think that Jiang, I'm not sure if I pronounced the last name correctly, is absolutely correct. As far as the quote is concerned, it brings me in mind of what some people have said about fantasy, that, you know, part of fantasy is, you know, is being able to deal with the stresses, you know, of the world, but, you know, putting enough sugar and candy around it so that you can do so, right? So in terms of climate fiction and nonfiction, you could say in some ways that science fiction can be a way of putting that coding depending on what you're dealing with it, because it is stressful, so it could be a way to look at it that way. And even some fiction, which inherently tries not to be about climate fiction, you might say, depending on the level of stress and anxiety, it could be a way to get away from that. So the negative aspect of it, the fact that it's not there, you might say, you can make an argument that is also about climate fiction. I'm not sure if that's what Kim Stanley Robinson was talking about explicitly, but you can make an argument for that in that case. But science fiction, or rather nonfiction that is separate from climate fiction, clearly, there are things that are different. There you can be talking about physics, you'd be talking about, the landing on the moon. These have nothing to do really with climate fiction, unless in the follow-up blog piece then is, why are we talking about the moon when we should be talking about what's going on over here? But those are two different conversations, kind of a forced connection, I think, sometimes.
Yeah, it can be subtle, it can be metaphoric, it can be symbolic, how the nonfiction is brought in or not. Yeah. BrightFlame, what can you add to that or subtract?
Well, speaking of subtle, what came to mind to me is the covert ways we can weave in real climate science and the climate emergency and how to move forward into fiction. Because, well, I write fiction because I prefer to read fiction than nonfiction. And to me, you can speak truth in a much bigger way, and people can hear and take in and change their way of thinking, change their beliefs when they're reading story. I've offered workshops about the cognitive science of story. Including a workshop I did, or a couple of them I did with Starhawk, where I think we called it Restoring the Future. And
I like that title.
And what we did is have people imagine the future they want to head towards. And I brought in a piece about the cognitive science of story and how we can help the world get there by creating story that will get us there. And I mean, basically, story, our minds, they know through functional MRI studies, our mind, when we're listening to or reading or experiencing story, is as if we are in the story experiencing it. And that's how beliefs are changed. Like public relations people know this, right? So even when we're trying to convey facts, so to speak, about the warming of the planet and sea rise projections and blah, 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 if we bury that in story, people will feel it more and feel the need to act, especially if we embed it in a story that's hopeful and that gives people the feeling of possibility, which is why I love solar punk and hope punk kind of things.
So the story provides the context and the meaning behind the reality, and I would use the word embed as opposed to bury, although I understand your use of the word bury, because it's as you said a dish in the beginning. I think you used the word subversive, or if you didn't, I'm
covert.
Using
Covert. Well,
okay,
I
covert.
was thinking of
same
that
thing. So the subversive use, of factual material is brought in, but brought in such a way through various literary devices to create that additional sense of urgency about the real world, right? And yet embedded in story, it carries you on and you want to read more, because some of us would probably stop with that. We don't want another fact. But we do want story. And so the whole concept of story, or whole idea of story, is movement, right? It moves us, and that's the power of story. as Rob Cameron was saying here, the power of the anecdotal and the news feed scroll. We can't help but look at that, right? Because it's in motion as well. It's really interesting. I mean, can I ask you all, are you doing this in your stories? And can you give us some examples of how you're doing it and possibly what the results are? And I'll start again with Jiang.
So I'm not sure I understood. What's the question?
Are you incorporating nonfiction, fact, whatever you want to call it, with your fiction, with your CliFi or whatever you're writing? It doesn't have to be CliFi necessarily, but are you incorporating those two? And how are you doing it? If the answer is no, then that's fine. We'll just go on to the next person. Or if you say no, you have to tell us why you wouldn't do such a thing. But is that even possible is my question. Sorry, I go ahead.
No worries. So I think it's often very difficult to know everything that has happened in history and what has not happened, especially in terms of climate. And if you're not an expert in the field, such as me, and to do all the research about it. But I find myself really leaning into talking about water climate disasters, floods, hurricanes, tsunamis, rising sea levels. And the way I incorporate it into my work, I tend to blur the lines by like the fiction side, by personifying nature, imagining nature's revenge,
Yes.
imagining what the natural world would think or say if they had a voice or the words to say it, and to imagine nature as a collective, as a community, and like ourselves as humans. And I do think
you used the word pluralize. Did you say that?
no. I think I was trying to say blur the lines, but it just
Blur the lines.
So
I
sorry.
thought you were making up a new word.
No.
Okay, pluralize.
I mean, we
I'm
can use
using
it
it,
too.
baby. Sorry to interrupt. Keep going.
No worries. But I think to make nature more like a seemingly human thing, like ourselves, brings a new perspective where like we might be able to better identify with nature.
Yes.
I took an anthropology course in the past, and they talked about the detriments of human-centric thinking when it comes to climate and the environment. And in a sense, I've tried to tap into that in attempts to drive more positive change in my fiction, a more reflective mindset about human relationships to and with nature by drawing on our similarities, if that makes sense.
Yeah. The personification of the other, essentially. Nature is othered in so many ways. And as a result of that, I think that is partly why we're where we are right now in terms of abuse and disrespect. And the idea behind, I mean, what you talked about there, by personifying that other, whether it's water, whether it's the forest, whether it's climate itself, which has its own, what a concept, right? To personify that brings it into the realm of empathy as well, which is, of course, what we want from our reader. So very strong. I just, before you leave with that, I want to ask if your book, Ling Guan, includes some of that personification.
So that one does not, but the new novella I just turned to my agent does. So it personifies the people of trees and their fight against industrialism.
Wonderful. I really look forward to that one. Let us know when it comes out, what's happening with it. I won't ask you to give the name. Sometimes people don't want to give the title until it's out, but we'll look forward to that. Rob, what do you feel like saying? I'm going to say it that way.
So with the books I'm on deadline for now, I can say no, not really, because they're not environmental based, but they also happen to be historical speculative fiction. So it's like being like I'm talking about Civil War, so it's not.
Okay.
But for my new pieces, and actually for the one I'm doing for Solar Punk magazine, it's not a story, but it's a call for stories, kind of what I'm calling solar punk noir. And the idea behind it really is that when we're writing, we are, I think, kind of pushing back against what's this postmodernism, right? Where it's the fragmentation of things. And there's a particular kind of fiction which is built into not only what we're writing, but the way that we see the world. No one knows everything. No one can only deal with what they've been told and seen, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a certain amount of fiction which is involved in that. And one of those fictions is the negativity of what it means to be human and what it means to be a human community, and particularly what it means to live and exist in a human city. And one of the examples I bring to mind is there's an idea of there was a very famous case about a woman who was murdered in Kew Gardens, and that all the people around her ignored her. They didn't call the police. They just let it happen, and then it kind of blew up into this thing. Became again part of the zeitgeist. It's kind of built on the idea that people are crap, and we cannot kind of build on. There's no sense of community in the reality situation. People did come to her aid almost immediately. That people, not the police, but neighbors found the person who killed her and held him there until they were able to apprehend, until the police finally did show up. Looking at data that shows that now in the modern era that people do step in. When there's an emergency, like during Hurricane Katrina, people don't wait to help. People are already engaged in the helping as soon as things happen. So, fighting against that fiction that we've grown with to something else that goes beyond this postmodernism to something that is healing, which I think is what solar punk is part of that tradition. It is a healing tradition. So as far as, any kind of fiction moving forward, being solar punk, whatever, moving beyond the dystopia, which we have, again, been, even though it does absolutely exist, it's been fictionalized into the norm, into the baseline for existence. That we're should be writing towards a more real, I think, or more nuanced idea of what it is to be a person and to react to systemic problems. And I think that is my hope, that climate fiction starts to move more towards that, and certainly for solar punk to deal with that fiction we've been living in.
Excellent. Thank you, Rob. BrightFlame.
Well, there are a bunch of things pop into my mind.
Oh, good.
I write about decentering humans among our Earth kin in a big way. All of the series of stories that I've been writing that are going to begin coming out in publications are set in a world where humans speak with forest, with individual trees and forest, and communicate with, for instance, the mycorrhizal network. And I mentioned earlier about weaving my teaching in with my writing, and thinking about nonfiction. I actually do this in the real world. I have a relationship with forest, especially in the place where I live. I do speak with trees, with forests, and I do that through techniques we use in my spiritual tradition. I also teach that stuff. So I forget what I called the workshop I did last year, something about being earth kin or something like that, where I weave experiential exercises through a session of how do we drop our individualism and open into communication with our earth kin, and what messages do you receive from that? So my I have a series of stories that take place in what I call the threaded communities. The trees are the elders in the community. So they have a big role, and they are characters all through the different stories that each have different plot lines. I also, going back to my thing about covert stuff, I offered a workshop for middle grade science teachers probably about 10 years ago as part of a professional development summer institute. It was a day-long thing where first I presented the science of plant communication, PowerPoint and everything, but then I took them outside to talk to trees, and I did that in a covert witchy way. I used the techniques that I use, and they really got a lot out of it. And so they broaden their way of gathering observation that they might use as science, and learn techniques they can use with kids in the classroom. So, weaving that stuff, decentering humans. And
yeah, definitely. I love that, BrightFlame. Along those lines, I'd like to pursue a little bit the idea again of incorporating reality, the nonfiction in our stories, and the power of storytelling, as BrightFlame mentioned earlier. Can we discuss? You're willing to discuss some of the ways that we do embed nonfiction and or messages that are underlying in the nonfiction idea or concepts or facts in story? How do we do that in story? How do you do that in story so that it isn't polemic? Not that polemic's a bad thing. There is some polemic that works really well. Not that it's didactic or putting off or off-putting, right? Or considered overly negative, like some dystopias are. So I had in one conference that I was talking at, someone came up and said, well, I've had enough of dystopias. I've had enough of all this crap that's going on. I mean, it's going on, but I want to hear something good. And without necessarily hearing a fantasy, not escaping per se, but just hearing the good side of things. How are you doing that in your works, and how important do you think it is? I know I'm asking several questions at the same time. You can answer any way you like. Jiang.
I think when I think of storytelling, especially on the darker and grimmer side, I do tend for rather tragic endings, I think, but I'm trying to move away from that to give more hope in my story, more morally gray stories, if that makes sense. Because I think, oh no, go ahead.
I was just going to ask you why. Why are you purposefully moving in that direction?
I think it's because in every story, just like in real life, not every situation or circumstance or people are completely one way or another, completely bad or completely good. And I think it's important to highlight that in fiction as well, especially because in the long tradition of fiction, there's a lot of polar opposite depictions where, oh, people are completely bad, or, nature is bad, things like that.
Yeah, and some people think that's to achieve dramatic, drama, and yet, oddly enough, it's just polarizing and stereotyping in many cases. So interesting. Keep going with your train of thought. You're going more positive, introducing that into your stories.
I think, especially with previously dystopian narratives being so popular and our world being not such a great place, at this moment with all things happening. I do think we need a lot more fiction that gives us hope, maybe solutions, even if far-fetched and imagined, to give us kind of a boost in morale or a light to follow.
A light. Yeah, I like that. Yeah. A direction again to go. I think someone said, I can't remember who it was, if you find yourself in hell, keep moving. Sorry, I'm the only one laughing, but there's something to that, right? It's all about motion, and story is about motion. This is the thing, is when we're all storytellers, we're all moving, and the word moving or movement has many meanings, right? Someone can be moved literally by a story, but you can physically move as well. And the whole point of story is that it takes us through that hell, if you will, into the light, presumably. It doesn't have to, which if it doesn't, then it's a tragedy, right? But for the most part, it will take us through, which is why I contend that dystopias can be hopeful. In fact, most of them are. And because they do move towards something, and they do show some optimism toward, I can't think of the words right now, not so much victory, but because victory implies other things, but overcoming and becoming essentially, and learning, etc. Rob, if you remember what I was asking there.
I think so. But I think before I get into, I think, the conversation around fiction, I just want to say that when it comes to the individual, I think, who is kind of in that constant traumatic state, I do want to go back to the social media for a moment, because that is primarily one of the things that is kind of conditioning that mindset. Besides the people around you, who you can only change to a certain extent, how you're engaging with what you're seeing online. You do actually have more control over the algorithm than you think.
Really?
You do have some. You do.
How so?
Because they are paying attention to the things that you are looking at automatically, and also because Facebook wants to keep your money, because Twitter wants to keep your attention, and Google as well. They're actually giving you the option and saying, "Hey, do you like this thing?"
That's fantastic thing to say. Sorry, Rob, I'm interrupting. That is really cool. I never thought of it that way. And but so that's looking at it from an empowered point of view.
And that's just, talking about the individual, right, having impact on these kind of systemic things. If you are posting, about green energy or science, whatever, Google will say, "Oh, this is what she liked. Let me give you more of that." Same thing with Facebook to an extent, only theirs is a little bit more opaque. But anyway, point being, though, that as the individual, there are some things that you can do. And the question, as far as the storytelling, I think you're talking about including the different mindset perspective. I think will definitely depend on the audience and the genre. So for certain kinds of science fiction, hard science fiction, they're cool with data dump, with info dump, a lot of stuff. Like, they want to get into like the engineering of how this thing works, because they're on a question of what they're looking for. I think some of it's the character, and some of it's, what the person is doing and the world that's being created and how they're solving the problem. So you have options dependent upon your perspective. So there's that. And then of course the actual character themselves, if they are of a mindset where we can do things rather than I am the hero, then I think that is also, helpful. Because one of the things about the different philosophies that we have historically lived through, there is the idea of we are waiting for this one person to do this thing. And I think that's starting to shift a bit. Again, Western media, English speaking, English looking media, but not as much as needs to be done. I think kind of we're at the beginning of that when we start seeing even things like, Game of Thrones, it's multiple characters. you know, and
Yep.
we're looking at how they're interacting. I think that's a good thing, and I think that that is something that is a kind of a psychological, you know, literary trend, a kind of psychoneurological trend, which I think we can lean into. So those perspectives where you're no longer monstering things, um, we should be doing and be paying attention to.
Mhm.
I think I answered the question.
Yeah, you did wonderfully. And I would just add, you know, from a character's point of view, that's what you were bringing up mostly. I love the social media point though, but that actually is part of it. It's the power of the character, the power of the characters, and the intersection of their perspectives. And when you said monstering, there's also the potential for the monster to have a POV. So what it's all about, the POVs, the point of view, provides some power to that character because the story is seen through their perspective. And therefore you have the chance to show many perspectives on the same thing. For instance, their perspective on the environment, on the same
just to
thing.
add one more thing about, again, the nonfiction, the way you live, we are living in a time, particularly now post-pandemic, where so many people are more online, where there are communities for you to be actively engaged with and acting on these things, you know, I think, and having power, or rather feeling powerless, I think, is one of those things that kind of leads to the dystopian perspective. So acting on these things are ways to kind of dissipate that dystopian feel. You know, if you learn anything from the right, you know, then you can see that they've kind of learned that lesson. Act on it.
Yeah. Yeah.
and it will become more of a reality.
Yeah. And just to finish that up in terms of the different perspectives and the perspective of the monster per se, of the other, I should say, to be a little bit better saying it, to provide perspective and POV to the other, such as non-human, such as environment, such as water, such as the beast, the trees, to actually give them a voice is to allow that nonfiction element, funnily enough, to come in, for one thing, to add factual material based on their idea of things, their existence, their existential ness, if you will. Now, I think I just made up a word. That's pretty cool. I love making up words. Anyway, what was that word that Jiang came up with? Actually, you didn't come up with it. I did. I just misunderstood. The point being that by introducing these different points of views, and BrightFlame was talking about that earlier, you bring in a whole other way of existing, of seeing. And as a result, we can then empathize and see things. But I want BrightFlame to talk on this point, if you may.
Well, I want to, because of what you just said, I also want to say that we who might be writing that kind of stuff now aren't the ones who invented this. This is an indigenous way of knowing and relating to the world.
Definitely.
And, you know, various indigenous nations, peoples, you know, have stories where the humans are decentered and they live as if they are in real relationships. They are in real relationships with water, with forest, with, you know, and, you know, I love that. And I'm a white settler on the lands that I'm on. So I work with how can I lift that way of living in the world, and, you know, have my own spiritual form and not be appropriative, but just help make that kind of thing more mainstream, more accessible to the wider world, that there are different ways of knowing. You know, so I do that in little bits through my writing, through my teaching, and lifting the voices of Indigenous writers and educators also. So,
I totally agree, BrightFlame. I think the power of storytelling and the true power of all writers is to provide point of view, is to give voice. And it's about time we give voice to the other. I know that's a whole different panel if we want to talk about stuff like that, but it does bring in this blur of nonfiction and fiction, of the different genres, if you will. It brings in the difference between archetype and reality. And we all play archetypes in our lives, and we use them in story as well, and they can be very powerful used that way. So, the mother archetype, the mentor, the trickster, nature as trickster, for instance, can imagine, right? Nature as mentor through various avatars of nature, through bear or tree, can really bring in these elements beautifully and powerfully. And I just, I think this is what we need to do. This is what we need to do. I don't know how much time we have. We have a few minutes left. I have this last question. Are there any nonfiction historical or current events that you'd like to see taken up by CliFi authors? And you can include yourselves if you've taken up something that is just you have a new project or you'd like to see something. Let's start with Rob.
Sorry, you're talking about something that I'm working on, or something that
something that you'd like to see, and you could be working on it already. That's all I'm saying.
Okay. So this is kind of convenient. So the essay that I did for Solarpunk magazine is kind of a call for fiction for solarpunk noir, and that is taking a look at cities where the main thrust is that we have made some positive, good choices about climate change, but then the enemy are those people who want to fight back and push for that previous status quo. And so that's kind of like the focal point, and it'll be coming out, I think, sometime in October or something. But yeah, I really
wonderful, wonderful. When you say October, you mean this October? Like,
yes.
Wow, cool, excellent.
I mean, Justine would know better when that's actually coming out.
Okay, there are no links to that as yet, eh?
No.
Okay.
It's second Tuesday of November, actually.
November. There we go.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Justine. Jiang. Anything out there that you'd like to see, or something you're already doing or will be doing or want to do?
So rather than anything specific or a specific set of events, I think I'd like to see climate fiction by writers all over the world that are particular to their homes and their surroundings. So local stories about loss due to climate, or triumph as they conquer a disaster, no matter the scale. So kind of like a working together of community to combat climate or kind of heal the environment.
So beat that solastalgia. Solastalgia, everybody knows that term. That's the grief we feel in losing our homes. So excellent idea, Jiang. That gets me tickly all over. BrightFlame.
I guess a lot. Stories of climate justice, of who are the frontline communities, and they're like, really diving into the people, like the real people who are being affected right now, who are, climate migrants now because their land's, taken over by the rising sea, for instance, or claimed by the floods, like in Pakistan. Also, just because it's kind of near and dear to me, a lot more about the ills of fracking and and pipelines and all that. That just one of so many possible stories. and somehow having that buried into like a real accessible story.
I would
Yeah.
just, sorry, one thing I would just add is we should definitely really get more into, or read more, do more research on the politics behind all these things when we start reading. And even though it can get kind of opaque, like the actual science behind it, because it's just, it makes for an interesting read for yourself, and also
Oh, yeah.
it just makes everything better rather than, yeah.
Yeah. Kim Stanley Robinson's Ministry of the Future. I suggest that to everybody here because he does do a really good job of getting into the politics of things, to be honest. What's possible, what isn't, how complex things really are, and then what we can still achieve. I mean, it's a very positive book. There's a lot of terrible stuff that happens, and it's very real. And it's based on realities, as you know, Margaret Atwood's books. This is what Margaret Atwood says too. Everything that she writes is, her speculative fiction is based on something real, something that has already happened in some way, and yet it is optimistic, and it's wonderfully done. We have just minutes left. Anyone have any last? Please, everybody, unmute yourselves and just give a last little hurrah or comment before we leave. Hey, Jiang.
Hurrah and comment.
You're funny, Rob. That's my comment. Aisha?
I think every time I come to a panel and I speak, it's always such a humbling experience because, as you know, all I know is that I know nothing. And by the end of it, there's like so much that I'm inspired by that I want to go and read up on and like learn more about, the world we live in and ourselves as humans. But
Thank you.
yeah,
Thank you for your wisdom and your humbleness. Rob, you have more to say than that.
No, I'm ditto what she said. I always look for new
I like that.
when I come to panels, and this is exactly why I come to these things, because it's fun. I just wish we could do it all in person.
You
but
got
hey,
it. Yeah, you got it. It is fun. BrightFlame?
Yes, fun and interesting learning opportunities. I want more also. I hope to keep the idea exchange going online somehow, like Solarpunk Magazine has a Discord server also. There's the Rewilding server, there's Twitter, places like that.
There's there is plenty of Discord Solarpunk communities too.
This is true. This is true. Well, we're at the end, and I'm just going to end with a mantra. Let's make Solarpunk real. There you go. And it's all about us authors. Let's make Solarpunk real. Yes. Thank you, everybody. Thanks for coming. Thank you, panelists. You were wonderful. Take care.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you.